This happened to me in Tempe, Arizona, not far from Mill Ave, where all the bars are at. I was out bar hopping with a group of friends one weekend having a good time, and had gotten pretty wasted. I have this terrible habit of wandering off and getting lost when I drink, and this particular night, I had managed to get myself into a very dumb situation. After wandering down streets for almost an hour, I started to realize I was very lost, and to make things worse, my phone was out of battery. At some point, I decided I would just walk back to my friend's house, which I knew was somewhere north of area we were bar hopping. I should mention I am severely incompetent when it comes to directions and navigating in a city, so I didn't realize I was a solid 7 to 8 miles away from my friend's place. As I was stumbling confidently along the empty roads at 2 a.m., a sedan suddenly pulled off the road in front of me, aggressively, almost blocking my path. Somewhat startled, I look towards the driver's side and see a rather large and mean-looking black man staring me down. In situations like this, most people have one of two reactions. They either become scared and defensive or angry and aggressive. I, on the other hand, am an insane person and was just drunk enough to have no sense of the danger I was in. I should mention I am your typical privileged suburban white boy, not particularly threatening or big. I proceeded to wave at the guy saying, "Hey man, what's good?" I am not completely sure, but I think I was probably smiling too. I specifically remember the face he made. It was a sort of confused and conflicted look, as if I were asking him what year it was. He paused for a second and asked me something, but I couldn't understand what he said. I said something like, "Huh?" He then asked me, "Where are you going?" I told him I was trying to walk to my friend's place, but I have no idea where I am. After another pause, he told me to get in. Without thinking, I walked over to the passenger side and hopped in. Pretty dumb, right? Well, at the time, it seemed like a good idea. Once I got in, I was able to get a better look at the guy. He was covered in tats and was wearing your typical thug attire. I also noticed his arm was all bandaged. Oh, and he had a pistol tucked into his shorts. And again, for some reason, none of this fazed me at the time. He asked me where my friend's place was, and I gave him directions. I'm pretty sociable and talkative when I drink, so I immediately started chatting with the guy casually. I don't remember exactly what we talked about, but eventually he started telling me that he had just gotten out of the hospital after being treated for a gunshot wound on his arm, and his girl just broke up with him because of it. Apparently she didn't like that he was in a gang and getting into gunfights. Go figure. He then told me that he was really pissed off about her and about getting shot, and he was driving around looking for someone to rob when he found me, and that he has served time for robbery in the past. At that point, my drunken brain started to connect the dots, and I thought about the roughly $200 I had in my wallet at that very moment. But instead of freaking out, I just said something like, "Damn man, that's rough." He also told me that he really wanted to be a rapper and was trying to get his music career started. I tried to be supportive, telling him to go for it. About 10 to 15 minutes later, we pulled up at my friend's place. Now this is when I should have gotten out of the car and told the armed man, "Thanks for the ride," but again, I'm an insane person and felt like I owed him one for taking me all the way there, so I asked if he wanted to come in and smoke. He said he was down. At this point, my friends had already been back for a while, and were all wondering what happened to me. As you might expect, they were awfully surprised when I showed up with a strange black dude, who I now knew was a gang member who had debated robbing me at gunpoint. What the dude did next sort of sketched everyone out though. Safe in his closet that is visible as soon as you walk in the room. I didn't realize it, but my new friend had brought his gun inside with him, and shortly after entering the room, after everyone said what's up, he took his gun out of his waistband and put it down right on top of the safe in front of everyone. It seemed like a really odd thing to do, but it was a lot better than what he could have done. I feel like it was a sort of show of respect, like he wanted to show that he wasn't going to use it. Luckily, I have super chill friends, so they acted cool and were about to roll up a blunt. So a few minutes later, we all went out back to smoke, leaving the gun in his room. The dude chilled with us for a while longer and actually seemed to get along with some of my friends who had a similar interest in music. He then picked up his gun off the safe and left without incident. Looking back, I realized that could have gone much, much worse, especially since my buddy had a lot of cash in that safe, and he could have easily robbed us at gunpoint at any time. I like to think that although he was a criminal and a gang member, he was also just a guy going through a hard time, and a little kindness and marijuana prevented that night from going very bad. It happened to me yesterday, late in the afternoon. I had just finished buying some snacks from the gas station when a man approached me as I was walking home. It was dark out, so the only thing I could make out was that he was about 2 inches taller than me, had a green jacket with a hood on, and had fair skin. He asks me what's in my backpack. I try walking away, but he grabs my bag and refuses to let me go. He demands I hand him the bag. I tried my best to plead with him, saying that he could have the food inside if he was hungry. He didn't care. He kept fighting me for the bag. I did my best, holding my ground and putting up a fight. Several drivers sped past me, and none of them bothered to stop and help me. I was all alone on a dark and empty sidewalk. This gas station was in a pretty ghetto part of town. Bunch of drug addicts and violent people. I used to live there, so I knew that cops were regularly called into that neighborhood. I'm glad I managed to escape that environment 2 years ago. Eventually, the man removes his hand from his pocket, and I start fearing for the worst. I almost expected him to pull out a knife, but thankfully, it was only his fist. He begins banging hard against my fists to the point they bleed. I couldn't take it anymore, so I handed him the bag and watched him run off. There was only some chips and juice in there, so it's not like I lost anything super valuable. I walked the entire way home, constantly looking over my shoulder in case that bastard came back for more. I didn't call the police because I knew nothing would be done about it. I barely even had a description of the guy, so they wouldn't really have anything to go off of. I'm currently at work with a bandaged hand, trying my best to get through the day despite the pain. I hope the guy who did all this ends up messing with the wrong person and gets the hell beaten out of him. I wish I never went to that neighborhood. I wish I had stayed home. For some background, I've grown up in South Africa my entire life and live in a generally safe area. Medical professionals in South Africa have to complete a year of community service, where the government places you in most likely a rural area where you are expected to work in a public facility and around the community. So being a medical professional, I moved to another province in South Africa for a year to complete my community service. I won't mention the area, but it is considered more rural than the regular South Africa city. Needless to say, not living there for very long, I wasn't always sure which hangout spots were considered safe and which I should rather avoid. Fast forward a few months into living in the new province, my boyfriend came to visit me. We drove around and noticed a huge park enclosed by a fence. There were tons of families walking around on the grass and sitting on benches, etc. We thought it looked pretty safe. So we chose a spot on a bench and sat down to talk. My boyfriend still lived back home, so we were doing the distance thing. I was sad that he was leaving again in 2 days and started crying. He calmed me down and we sat looking at the people walking around. Next thing we know, there are 2 guys walking from about 20 meters away, straight towards us. They looked extremely sketchy, clothes mismatched and torn, and the typical gangster walk. We thought they might walk past us, but they literally walked straight up to us. And being from South Africa, my boyfriend and I both had a bad feeling about the encounter to come. They approached us, we froze in place, and instead of getting up and walking away, we just sat there. One of the gangsters, covered in gang tattoos, crouched down next to me, while the other one went around to my boyfriend and stood close next to him. The idiot on my side had weird bandages or some type of white glove on his hand. They asked us if we could help them with some money because they got out of jail yesterday. We said we don't have one, but they were persistent and wouldn't leave us alone. I started freaking out at this point because I've been robbed before, and I knew their persistent behavior could and probably would escalate to violence. They told us that they didn't want to hurt us, but just wanted money or whatever else we have to give. My boyfriend realized this too, and took out his brand new phone in the hopes that they would leave us alone. They took the phone and glanced at it a few times. This brand is not common in South Africa, and because they couldn't recognize it, they said they didn't want the phone. They kept surrounding us and walking behind us and crouching down, which we assume was so that the other people around us didn't see them. I tried to hide my car keys in my pocket because I was scared they'd try to take the car as they kept looking at my pockets. I didn't know what to do, so I just kept crying. I told the gangsters that we just found out my boyfriend's dad passed away and they cannot see that we are very upset. Luckily, as said before, I was already crying before they arrived, so it didn't seem like a lie. The one on my boyfriend's side's demeanor immediately changed, and he apologized and gave his condolences. The other gangster crouching beside me didn't seem to care and reached into his pocket. At this point, I was very sure something bad would happen if we didn't leave, so I grabbed my boyfriend's hand and tried to run away. They just stood there watching us, and luckily didn't follow. For anyone wondering, South Africa's crime rate is very high. One of the highest in the world, and while most areas are safe, you can never escape situations like this. For anyone thinking we might have been prejudiced because they didn't actually do anything, I can promise you that when you see a South African gangster, you will know. They are also known for being cold and ruthless, so I'm glad we made it out of there unharmed. I don't want to know what could have happened if we didn't get out when we did. During my first and only semester of college, my very good friend Jake was dating this girl Stacy that we knew in high school. For reference, I'm female, and I was 18 at the time, now 26. Now, many people back in high school did not like Stacy, and I was one of them. To me, she was the definition of a sketchy person. She was a pathological liar, and not even a good one, as her stories rarely added up, and she would constantly contradict herself, sometimes within minutes after she spouted her lie. She was one of those girls that hated drama, yet it always magically seemed to follow her around anywhere she went. She was constantly in and out of relationships throughout high school, and would go out of her way to prove they were crazy by spreading rumors about them and getting as much sympathy from everyone around her as she could. She always had to be the center of attention wherever she went. I remember during prom night, she was dancing with her then boyfriend, and he accidentally stepped on her foot while dancing, and she caused a huge scene about how he was physically abusing her. It was painful to watch. There's much more I could get into about this chick, but in general, she's just an extremely toxic person who nobody should be subjected to be in the presence of. It's also worth noting that she had a drug problem that she often tried to hide. Anyway, back to the story. Jake and Stacy had a class together and hit it off rather quickly. Jake was skeptical at first, but when Jake brought up her reputation in high school, Stacy claimed that she was raped by an ex-boyfriend she had, and that's why she acted the way she did, and that she worked on getting better and was fine now. My friend, being incredibly insecure about being single and being way too trustworthy, believed her, and they began dating soon after. The relationship was extremely dysfunctional and was rampant with emotional abuse and manipulation on her end. But the aspect I want to focus on was her constantly trying to squeeze money out of him and her aforementioned drug problem. Stacy would constantly ask Jake for small amounts of money here and there, usually ranging between $10 to $20. Bad, but one day she asked for $500 to cover her rent, which he refused. She flipped out on him and didn't talk to him until she drunk dialed him late at night and began revealing that she was doing drugs. And it was all because of how terrible her life was and that he wasn't helping. I don't know why he didn't break up with her then and there, but the next day they talked it out and made up, and the issue was dropped. Here's where everything finally comes to a head. It was around 10:30-ish on a Friday night, and keep in mind, they've been dating for nearly 2 months at this point. I'm chilling in my living room with another friend of mine. We're sitting on the couch, bullshitting about stuff going on in our lives, and I get a call from Jake. Jake explained to me that Stacy was hanging out at a friend's house for the day and asked him if he could pick her up at around midnight, as the buses in that area stopped running after 8, and she needed to be at work at 9 the next morning. He said sure, and as the time he needed to leave to pick her up drew closer, his mother called him saying she was working overtime and wouldn't be out until midnight, and she had the car. He asked if I could drive with him and go pick Stacy up. I'll admit, I would rather have left her to her own devices, but he sounded desperate, and he is an amazing friend who would do anything for me. So I did him a solid and told him to start walking over to my house. He gets to my house about 40 minutes later. My friend went back to her house and Jake and I got in my car. He texts her that he's leaving now and that I was driving him to, which she said the dreaded K. I drove an '04 Subaru Impreza RX STI at the time for reference. We reached Stacy's friend's house, which was located on the outskirts of town in a pretty sketchy neighborhood. The road was very poorly lit, and to my luck, the street light in front of Stacy's friend's house was off. I refused to park in front of there as I didn't feel comfortable sitting in the dark, so I parked 3 houses down between 2 cars under a functional street light. Jake texts Stacy, "We're here." She doesn't respond. As we were waiting there, a truck drove by, and I noticed about 4 men in the truck looking around for something. At first, I figured maybe they were lost and looking for an address, but this thought was thrown out the window when not even 2 minutes later, the truck drove by again. This time slower. The guy in the front passenger seat makes direct eye contact with me as the truck passes my car by. I tell Jake something is definitely wrong and to call Stacy so we can leave. He agrees and calls her, and it's dead quiet outside so I can hear the conversation. She answers and says, "Hey, where are you?" "We're down the block." "Come outside," Jake said. "I'm looking outside and I don't see your car." She answered back, "We're in Running in Circles 234's car. It's a gray Subaru." Jake said back, and almost immediately after he says that the phone call drops. Jake just looks at his phone in complete confusion, wondering what the hell is going on. I'm starting to get extremely nervous now between both the truck that was circling around before and Stacy's sketchy behavior. I decide that if something is up, I'm not just going to be a sitting duck and stay parked on the road if shit goes south. I pull out of the spot to drive up in front of the house, and as I'm pulling out, I hear a vehicle loudly in the distance behind us, and I look in my rearview mirror to see the truck from, before now, turning quickly driving up the block. I freak out and floor it out of the spot and begin speeding up the block. The truck catches up with me and Jake yells at me to turn and that they're trying to shoot the car. To my horror, I look behind me and the guy in the back seat is leaning out the window with a gun in his hand aiming at the car. I quickly turned and floor it down the road as they struggled to mirror what I did. I made another left turn, narrowly missing an oncoming car, and slammed on the gas. Luckily, I'm halfway down the block by the time they turn onto it. I'm surprised I was driving as well as I was at the time. Jake said I looked extremely calm and determined during all of this, but internally, I was freaking out. I was worried they were going to run me off the road or we were going to get a bullet shot through the back of our skulls. I made another left turn and drove like a bat out of hell towards the highway. The truck turned onto the block when I was about a block down, but stopped and turned down another block when I got close to the highway. I turn onto the highway and merge into the next lane. A few minutes pass by with us going back and forth questioning who those guys were and what they wanted, until Jake gets a call on his phone from Stacy. He picks it up, puts it on speaker, and shakes his head. "Where are you?" "I'm fucking waiting for you," she screams. He explains the situation, to which she proceeds to call him a liar and says he's not actually here and was standing her up. Jake loses his shit and screams at her that we almost got killed and calls her out on her bizarre behavior throughout all of this. She starts yelling again, but she goes silent, and we hear a door quickly open and someone loudly yells in the background on the phone, "They got away!" "Stacy, where the fuck are you?" Silence follows this for a few seconds before she hangs up the phone. Jake and I looked at each other and Jake said, "She had something to do with this." Long story short, we spent the entire drive theorizing why this happened, and we think we may have hit what happened. Jake brought up her asking for money before, and when she asked for $500, she probably needed the money to pay off a dealer, and when she didn't get it, she had to find another way. We think she set us up to head to that house to pick her up, and those guys, who were probably the dealer and his buddies, would conveniently show up looking to rob us of everything we had on us, and possibly jack the car hoping it would cover her debt. She probably thought Jake was using his car and gave them the description of his car, not realizing we were using my car, which might explain why they circled the block in confusion, and why she hung up the phone immediately after Jake gave her a description of my vehicle, as she probably called them to update them. I dropped Jake off at his house, and I went home. I know people say after scary encounters that they're always shaken up and their emotions are running in a million directions, but I was just emotionally drained. I felt like I just couldn't feel anything and just wanted to go home and go to bed, which was what I immediately did when I got home. I filed a police report the next morning on those guys, and they said they'd look into it, but I never heard anything after I filed the report, so who knows what they've been up to ever since. As far as Stacy goes, our theory was further solidified when Jake saw her in class on Monday, where she approached him and berated him for Friday night, claiming she walked all the way home and had her phone and wallet stolen by some druggies. Jake basically called her out on that whole night, claiming she set us up to get robbed, to which she denied and called him crazy. He told her they were done, and she just yelled, "Fine," and walked to the back of the room. The druggies were probably the dealer and his friends who robbed her to cover the debt. To our surprise, she never attempted contact with us again and kept her distance, probably because she knew we were onto her and wanted to keep the heat off of her. After I dropped out, I never saw her again, and last I heard anything about her was from Jake, where he told me she developed a long-distance relationship with some guy online and dropped out halfway through the semester to move to Massachusetts to live with him. As far as I know, that was the last anyone I know ever saw or heard from her. Overall, I'm happy I trusted my instincts and picked up on the fact that something was wrong, as this encounter may have had a different outcome. In hindsight, they most likely weren't going to kill us, but that's easier to say after the fact, because at the time, we didn't know what their intentions were, and for all we know, they may have even had more planned than just to rob us. This was the first of quite a few scary and creepy experiences I've had in my life. And this actually wasn't the scariest one for me, but that's another story for another time.